Chapter 1. The Luncheon. Have you ever given a treat to someone in a restaurant? What would happen if your guest orders so many things in a restaurant and you find yourself unable to pay for it? What would you do? The same thing happens to the writer when he invites a friend to an expensive French restaurant. Let's read and enjoy this humorous story.
I caught sight of her at the play, and in answer to her beckoning, I went over during the interval and sat down beside her. It was long since I had last seen her, and if someone had not mentioned her name, I hardly think I would have recognized her. She addressed me brightly.
Well, it's many years since we first met. How time does fly. We are none of us getting any younger. Do you remember the first time I saw you? You asked me to luncheon.
Did I remember? It was 20 years ago, and I was living in Paris. I had a tiny apartment in the Latin Quarter overlooking a cemetery, and I was earning barely enough money to keep body and soul together. She had read a book of mine and had written to me about it. I answered, thanking her, and presently I received from her another letter saying that she was passing through Paris and would like to have a chat with me. But her time was limited, and the only free moment she had was on the following Thursday. She was spending the morning at the Luxembourg, and would I give her a little luncheon at Feuert's afterwards. Feuert's is a restaurant at which the French senators eat, and it was so far beyond my means that I had never even thought of going there. But I was flattered, and I was too young to have learned to say no to a woman. I had 80 francs to last me the rest of the month, and a modest luncheon should not cost more than 15. If I cut out coffee for the next 2 weeks, I could manage well enough. I answered that I would meet my friend by correspondence at Feuert's on Thursday at 12:30. She was not so young as I expected, and in appearance imposing rather than attractive. She was, in fact, a woman of 40, and she gave me the impression of having more teeth, white and large and even, than were necessary for any practical purpose. She was talkative, but since she seemed inclined to talk about me, I was prepared to be an attentive listener. I was startled when the bill of fare was brought, for the prices were a great deal higher than I had anticipated. But she reassured me.
I never eat anything for luncheon.
She said. Oh, don't say that, I answered generously.
I never eat more than one thing. I think people eat far too much nowadays. A little fish, perhaps. I wonder if they have any salmon.
Well, it was early in the year for salmon, and it was not on the bill of fare. But I asked the waiter if there was any. Yes, a beautiful salmon has just come in. It was the first they had. I ordered it for my guest. The waiter asked her if she would have something while it was being cooked.
No,
she answered.
I never eat more than one thing, unless you have a little caviar. I never mind caviar.
My heart sank a little. I knew I could not afford caviar, but I could not very well tell her that. I told the waiter by all means to bring caviar. For myself, I chose the cheapest dish on the menu, and that was a mutton chop.
I think you are unwise to eat meat,
she said.
I don't know how you can expect to work after eating heavy things like chops. I don't believe in overloading my stomach.
Then came the question of drink.
I never drink anything for luncheon,
she said. Neither do I answered promptly.
Except white wine.
She proceeded as though I had not spoken.
These French white wines are so light. They're wonderful for digestion.
What would you like? I asked, hospitable still, but not exactly effusive. She gave me a bright and amicable flash of her white teeth.
My doctor won't let me drink anything but champagne.
I fancy I turned a trifle pale. I ordered half a bottle. I mentioned casually that my doctor had absolutely forbidden me to drink champagne.
What are you going to drink then?
Watered, she ate the caviar, and she ate the salmon. She talked gaily of art and literature and music. But I wondered what the bill would come to. When my mutton chop arrived, she took me quite seriously to task.
I see that you're in the habit of eating a heavy luncheon. I'm sure it's a mistake. Why don't you follow my example and just eat one thing? I'm sure you'd feel ever so much better for it.
I am only going to eat one thing, I said, and the waiter came again with the bill of fare. She waved him aside with an airy gesture.
No, I never eat anything for luncheon, just a bite. I never want more than that, and I eat that more as an excuse for conversation than anything else. I couldn't possibly eat anything more unless they have some of those giant asparagus. I should be sorry to leave Paris without having some of them.
My heart sank. I had seen them in the shops, and I knew that they were horribly expensive. My mouth had often watered at the sight of them. Madame wants to know if you have any of those giant
asparagus.
I asked the waiter.
I tried with all my might to will him to say no.
A happy smile spread over his broad, priest-like face, and he assured me that they had some so large, so splendid, so tender, that it was a marvel.
I'm not in the least hungry.
My guest sighed.
But if you insist, I don't mind having some asparagus.
I ordered them.
Aren't you going to have any?
No, I never eat
asparagus.
I know there are people who don't like them. The fact is, you ruin your taste by all the meat you eat.
We waited for the
asparagus
to be cooked. Panic seized me. It was not a question now how much money I should have left over for the rest of the month, but whether I had enough to pay the bill. It would be embarrassing to find myself 10 francs short and be obliged to borrow from my guest. I could not bring myself to do that. I knew exactly how much I had, and if the bill came to more, I made up my mind that I would put my hand in my pocket and with a dramatic cry start up and say it had been picked. Of course, it would be awkward if she had not money enough either to pay the bill. Then the only thing would be to leave my watch and say I would come back and pay later. The
asparagus
appeared. They were enormous, juicy, and appetizing. I watched the wicked woman thrust them down her throat in large mouthfuls, and in my polite way I spoke about the condition of the drama in the Balkans. At last she finished. "Coffee?" I said.
Yes, just an ice cream and coffee.
She answered. I was past caring now, so I ordered coffee for myself and an ice cream and coffee for her.
You know, there is one thing I thoroughly believe in,
she said, as she ate the ice cream.
One should always get up from a meal, feeling one could eat a little more.
Are you still hungry? I asked faintly.
Oh no, I'm not hungry. You see, I don't eat luncheon. I have a cup of coffee in the morning and then dinner, but I never eat more than one thing for luncheon. I was speaking for you.
Oh, I see. Then a terrible thing happened. While we were waiting for the coffee, the head waiter, with an ingratiating smile on his false face, came up to us bearing a large basket full of huge peaches. They had the blush of an innocent girl. They had the rich tone of an Italian landscape. But surely peaches were not in season then. Lord knew what they cost. I knew too, a little later, for my guest, going on with her conversation, absent-mindedly took one.
You see, you filled your stomach with a lot of meat.
My one miserable little chop.
And you can't eat any more. But I have just had a snack, and I shall enjoy a peach.
The bill came, and when I paid it, I found that I had only enough for a quite inadequate tip. Her eyes rested for an instant on the 3 francs I left for the waiter. And I knew that she thought me mean. But when I walked out of the restaurant, I had the whole month before me and not a penny in my pocket.
Follow my example,
she said as we shook hands.
And never eat more than one thing for luncheon.
I'll do better than that, I retorted. I'll eat nothing for dinner tonight.
Humorist,
she cried gaily, jumping into a cab.
You're quite a humorist.
But I have had my revenge at last. I do not believe that I am a vindicative man. But when the immortal gods take a hand in the matter, it is pardonable to observe the result with complacency. Today, she weighs 21 stone.
Chapter 2. A piece of advice. Do you lose your temper when someone does something wrong to you? Most of the people retaliate in a violent manner when something wrong is done to them. But this is not the proper way, and they actually harm themselves by doing so. Let's read this piece of writing on the same topic from the life of Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, former High Commissioner for India in the United Kingdom. The best advice I ever had came from one of the greatest souls the world has ever known, Mahatma Gandhi, on a sunny afternoon. Most people pass through a period of anguish when their belief in humanity is at a low ebb. I was in such a period. My husband had recently died. My deep sorrow over his loss was followed by the humiliating realization that in the eyes of the Indian law I had no individual existence. Along with other Indian women, I had participated for years with men in the national struggle for freedom, working and suffering side by side with them, until it had finally been achieved. Yet in law, we women were still recognized only through our relationship to men. Now, as a widow without a son, I was not entitled to any share of the family property, nor were my 2 daughters. I resented this galling position. I was bitter towards those members of my family who supported this antiquated law. At this time, I went to pay my respects to Gandhi and say goodbye before leaving for America to take part in the Pacific Relations Conference. After our talk, he asked,
"Have you made peace with your relatives?"
I was amazed that he would take sides against me. I have not quarrelled with anyone, I replied, but I refuse to have anything to do with those who take advantage of an outworn law to create a difficult and humiliating situation for me. Gandhiji looked out of the window for a moment. Then he turned to me and smiled and said,
"You will go and say goodbye because courtesy and decency demand this. In India, we still attach importance to these things."
"No," I declared. "Not even to please you will I go to those who wish to harm me."
"No one can harm you except yourself,"
he said, still smiling.
"I see enough bitterness in your heart to cause you injury unless you check it."
I remained silent, and he continued,
"You are going to a new country because you are unhappy and want to escape. Can you escape from yourself? Will you find happiness outside when there is bitterness in your heart? Think it over. Be a little humble. You have lost a loved one. That is sorrow enough. Must you inflict further injury on yourself because you lack courage to cleanse your own heart.
His words would not leave me. They gave me no peace. After some days of severe struggle with myself, I finally telephoned my brother-in-law. I would like to see him and his family, I said before leaving. I hadn't been with them 5 minutes before I sensed that my visit had brought a feeling of relief to everyone. I told my plans and asked their good wishes before starting on this new stage of my life. The effect on me was miraculous. I felt as if a great burden had been lifted and I was free to be myself. This small gesture was the beginning of a significant change in me. A year and a half later, I was in New York, leader of the Indian delegation to the United Nations. Important to us was India's complaint regarding the treatment of people of Indian origin in the Union of South Africa. Harsh things were said by both sides. I resented the manner in which my opponents made personal attacks, harmful to India's prestige and to mine. I struck back with the same sharp weapons. Then, after a distressing duel of words, I suddenly thought of Gandhiji. Would he approve? To him, means were as important as the end in the long run. Perhaps more important. What if we succeeded in getting our resolution passed by questionable tactics that injured our self-respect? Before going to bed that night, I resolved that come what might, no word of mine would be lightly used in the UN. From then on, I lifted the debate back to where it belonged, refusing to retaliate, to personal attack, or to score a cheap point. Our opponents met us on the new level, and from then on we argued the case on its merits. Before leaving the committee room on the last day, I went up and spoke to the leader of the opposing delegation. I have come to ask you to forgive me if I have hurt you by any word or action in this debate. He shook my hand warmly and said,
I have no complaint.
It was good to feel right with him, but even better to feel right with myself. Once more, Gandhiji's advice had saved me from myself. His words have helped me retain perspective, even in small matters. Many women, I imagine, share with me a recurring nightmare. Someone important to you is coming to dine. The guests have arrived. It is time to eat, but there is no dinner. You wake perspiring, relieved to find it is only a dream. But recently it really happened to me. My guests of honor, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Lady Eden, could hardly have been more important to me. High Commissioner for my country in the United Kingdom. I had planned everything meticulously, from the menu to the color scheme of the flowers and the candles. When the guests had arrived and drinks had been passed twice, I signaled the butler to announce dinner. But still we waited. When, for the third time, drinks came round, I excused myself and ran downstairs to the kitchen. It presented a shocking sight. In one corner stood a frightened little kitchen maid, in another the housekeeper. At the table sat my cook, waving a ladle and singing, beating time with his foot. His eyes were glazed, and he was far away in some other sphere. The table was littered with pieces of chicken. My knees felt too weak to support me, but I asked in as normal a voice as I could command, "Why isn't the dinner ready?"
But it is ready, madam.
My cook chanted.
All ready? Everybody sit down. Sit down.
I was furious. It was on the tip of my tongue to say, "Get out, you're dismissed." When I thought of the counsel that had calmed me so many times, if I lost control, I would only hurt myself. I pulled myself together. "Let's get something on the table," I said. Everyone pitched in. The food served wasn't quite what the menu described, but when I told my guests what had happened, there was a chorus of surprise.
If this is what your cook gives you when he's drunk,
someone exclaimed,
what must he provide sober?
The relief in my laughter must have sounded a little hysterical. My perspective restored, I realized that a dinner party, however important, is not the pivot of existence. To retain a sense of proportion is as important as being able to keep one's heart free from hatred. For all of us, no matter what our work. The advice Gandhiji gave me is meaningful. No one can harm you but yourself. Gandhiji's message to Vijay Lakshmi was not that it is wrong to experience negative emotions or feelings of anger, nor was his message that she should go through life allowing people to take unfair advantage of her. Rather, what Gandhiji taught and demonstrated for Vijay Lakshmi and the rest of us is that we must not let the actions or words of others determine our responses. Magnanimous people make the choice to respond to the indignities of others based upon their own principles and their own value system, rather than their moods or anger. Chapter 3. In the bazaars of Hyderabad. Do you like shopping? Do you visit markets regularly? Can you recall the sight of the market you often visit? The poet has beautifully presented the common pictures of the markets of Hyderabad. What do you sell, O ye merchant? Richly your wares are displayed, turbans of crimson and silver, tunics of purple brocade, mirrors with panels of amber, daggers with handles of jade. What do you weigh, O ye vendors? Saffron and lentil and rice. What do you grind, O ye maidens? Sandalwood, henna and spice. What do you call, O ye peddlers? Chessmen and ivory dice. What do you make, O ye goldsmiths? Wristlet and anklet and ring. Bells for the feet of blue pigeons, frail as a dragonfly's wing. Girdles of gold for dancers, scabbards of gold for the king. What do you cry, O ye fruitmen? Citron, pomegranate, and plum. What do you play, O musicians? Sitar, sarangi, and drum. What do you chant, O magicians? Spells for eons to come. What do you weave, O ye flower girls, with tassels of osier and red, crowns for the brow of a bridegroom, chaplets to garland his bed, sheets of white blossoms new garnered, to perfume the sleep of the dead. Chapter 4. After 20 years. How many friends do you have? Are all the childhood friends of yours still with you? Many of them would have been lost. How would you feel if you suddenly meet a very good friend of yours after a long period of time? This story is about two friends who are going to meet again after 20 years. Let's read this story and find out what happens. The policeman on the beat moved up the avenue impressively. The impressiveness was habitual and not for show, for spectators were few. The time was barely 10 o'clock at night, but chilly gusts of wind with a taste of rain in them had well-nigh de-peopled the streets. Trying doors as he went, twirling his club with many intricate and artful movements, turning now and then to cast his watchful eye adown the Pacific thoroughfare. The officer, with his stalwart form and his slight swagger, made a fine picture of a guardian of the peace. The vicinity was one that kept early hours. Now and then you might see the lights of a cigar store or of an all-night lunch counter. But the majority of the doors belonged to business places that had long since been closed. When about a midway of a certain block, the policeman suddenly slowed his walk. In the doorway of a darkened hardware store, a man leaned with an unlighted cigar in his mouth. As the policeman walked up to him, the man spoke up quickly.
"It's all right, officer,"
he said reassuringly.
"I'm just waiting for a friend. It's an appointment made 20 years ago. Sounds a little funny to you, doesn't it? Well, I'll explain if you'd like to make certain it's all straight. About that long ago, there used to be a restaurant where this store stands. Big Joe Brady's restaurant. Until 5 years ago,"
said the policeman.
"it was torn down then."
The man in the doorway struck a match and lit his cigar. The light showed a pale, square-jawed face with keen eyes, and a little white scar near his white eyebrow. His scarf pin was a large diamond, oddly set.
20 years ago tonight?"
said the man.
I dined here at Big Joe Brady's with Jimmy Wells, my best chum and finest chap in the world. He and I were raised here in New York, just like two brothers together. I was 18 and Jimmy was 20. The next morning, I was to start for the West to make my fortune. You couldn't have dragged Jimmy out of New York. He thought it was the only place on the earth. Well, we agreed that night that we would meet here again exactly 20 years from that date and time. No matter what our conditions might be or from what distance we might have to come, we figured that in 20 years each of us ought to have our destiny worked out and our fortunes made, whatever they were going to be. It sounds pretty interesting,
said the policeman.
Rather a long time between meets, though, it seems to me. Haven't you heard from your friend since you left? Well, yes, for a time we corresponded,
said the other.
But after a year or two, we lost track of each other. You see, the West is a pretty big proposition, and I kept hustling around over it pretty lively. But I know Jimmy will meet me here if he's alive, for he always was the truest, staunchest old chap in the world. He'll never forget. I came 1,000 miles to stand in this door tonight, and it's worth it if my old partner turns up.
The waiting man pulled out a handsome watch, the lids of it set with small diamonds.
3 minutes to 10.
The two men started up the street, arm in arm. The man from the West, his egotism, enlarged by success, was beginning to outline the history of his career. The other, submerged in his overcoat, listened with interest. At the corner stood a drugstore, brilliant with electric lights. When they came into this glare, each of them turned simultaneously to gaze upon the other's face. The man from the West stopped suddenly and released his arm.
You're not Jimmy Wells,
he snapped.
20 years is a long time, but not long enough to change a man's nose from a Roman to a pug. It sometimes changes a good man into a bad one,
said tall man.
You've been under arrest for 10 minutes, Silky Bob. Chicago thinks you may have dropped over our way and wires us. She wants to have a chat with you. Going quietly, are you? That's sensible. Now, before we go on to the station, here's a note I was asked to hand to you. You may read it at the window. It's from Patrolman Wells.
The man from the West unfolded the little piece of paper and handed him. His hand was steady when he began to read, but it trembled a little by the time he had finished. The note was rather short.
Bob, I was at the appointed place on time. When you struck the match to light your cigar, I saw it was the face of the man wanted in Chicago. Somehow I couldn't do it myself, so I went around and got a plain clothes man to do the job. Jimmy.
Chapter 5. Medical Miracle. Do you know what heart transplant means? Do you know who was the first to carry out the most risky job of heart transplant in medical history? Yes, it was Christian Barnard, who created history in 1967 by performing the world's first human heart transplant. Earlier, patients suffering from severe heart disease were certain to die. Let's study about Christian Barnard, the miracle surgeon.
On Saturday, I was a surgeon in South Africa, very little known. On Monday, I was world-renowned.
Thus, Dr. Christian Barnard recalled a weekend in 1967, when he became the first person to perform a heart transplant on a human being, a previously unheard-of operation. Barnard's unique approach to the human heart changed this area of medical procedures forever. For this pioneering doctor, it meant lifelong celebrity and worldwide renown. But he later expressed surprise at the publicity his own techniques had generated of the operation that caused such a furor. He explained,
"I did not even inform the hospital superintendent what we were doing, did I?"
The son of a poor Afrikaner preacher from Beaufort, West, a town on South Africa's semi-arid Great Karoo Plateau, Barnard walked 5 miles each day to study at Cape Town University before becoming a family physician on the Western Cape. In the late 1950s, he altered his medical field and went to the United States to study the latest operative techniques in cardiac treatment. By 1967, Barnard was a well-respected cardiothoracic surgeon at the Groote Schumer Hospital back in Cape Town and had already conducted many heart experiments on animals. He explained,
"For me, the heart has always been an organ without any mystique attached to it, merely a primitive pump."
Then his patient, Louis Washkansky, chose to undergo pioneering surgery, even though the odds against success were slim. On 3 December 1967, Barnard led a 30-man medical team in transferring the heart of a 25-year-old motor accident victim into Washkansky's body, and medical history was made. But Washkansky was just not strong enough to survive. This very sick man died from a lung infection 18 days later, and the prospects for heart transplant patients did not improve for a few years. However, Barnard had spearheaded a significant medical advance, and he was thrust into the international limelight. He never fit the archetypal image of an eminent surgeon. Young and handsome, he spent as much time in nightclubs as in operating theatres. He was feted wherever he went, received by the Pope in Rome, and entertained by the likes of President Johnson in America. After his breakthrough, he continued to work with a professional passion that excited the public. He was the pioneer of further cardiac techniques. These included double transplants, joining a healthy heart to the patient's to create a double pump, designing artificial heart valves, and using monkeys' hearts to keep desperately ill people alive. Barnard never stopped working, writing scientific books and novels, and in later life, spending much of his time at the Baptist Medical Center in Oklahoma, USA, where he tried to find a way to slow the aging process. It seemed as if he was searching for a miracle to match his first. He was a figure who always courted controversy, be it clashing with the South African authorities over issues of apartheid, or admitting he had practiced passive euthanasia on terminally ill patients, including his own mother. His ego was certainly healthier than the many patients he handled. But the energy and conviction that made Christian Barnard appear at times rather too sure of himself were the same qualities that ensured a dramatic breakthrough in a prohibitively complicated field of medicine. The man who believed that the individual is the brain, not the heart, nevertheless caught the imagination of the world with his passion for the heart pump. Chapter 6. An Irishman foresees his death. How brave the soldiers of a country are who put their lives at risk just to defend their country. In the given poem, the poet has expressed his feelings of an Air Force pilot who is fighting for his country.
"I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight I do not hate. Those that I guard I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross. My countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or leave them happier than before. Nor law, nor duty bade me fight, nor public man, nor cheering crowds, a lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath. a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death.
Chapter 7. By Road to Lhasa. How interesting a journey is in the hills by road. Have you ever enjoyed such a journey so far? In this chapter, the writer describes his own real-life experiences in fine details and good humor. Such a piece of writing is called a personal recount. Let's read this personal recount of one of India's finest writers, Vikram Seth.
Lhasa is now just 150 kilometers away. We should be there in about 4 hours, probably before nightfall. The map is encouraging. A plain, a mountain range, the Trans-Himalayan range, and then the Lhasa Valley. My headache cannot touch my high spirits. As soon as I get to Lhasa, I will begin formalities for further travel. I know it may take a long time, and my Chinese documents expire in 2 weeks. This worries me, but there is nothing I can do to speed things up. And today, if only we arrive before sunset, I will see the Potala.
This train of thought is punctured by Sui slamming on the brakes. The truck comes to a halt. Gyan Singh and I ask him what the matter is. Sui is looking for something on the floor of the truck among the bags and boxes.
Fish, he says. It'll be dark in a few hours. It transpires that Sui's wife likes fish, and Sui is now near one of his favorite fishing spots. He gets a net out from among the luggage. Let's catch fish in that stream, says Sui. Gyan Singh and I are not taken by the idea, especially as it is raining. Come on, it'll only take half an hour. Nonsense, says Gyan Singh. It won't take half an hour. The stream is shallow because of the rains. There won't be any fish, but it will take you 2 hours to realize this. No, I've fished here before, insists Sui. Come along now, Gyan Singh. Give me a hand with the net. We walk over to the stream, through the damp tussocks and yak dung, spread the net and wait in the rain. 2 hours later, we are back in the truck. Gyan Singh and I are quiet. There is a gleam of anger in Sui's eye. He drives the truck at a tremendous speed. The sun is now out and a beautiful rainbow colors the sky. But Sui is darkly obsessed. Gone is the pain of his weeping eye. Gone the recognition that it is less than 2 hours to sunset. All he can think about as he speeds along the now smooth and metalled road is how to entice fish into his net. Could we just stop here for a minute? I'd like to take a picture of the truck and the rainbow together. We stop the truck, and before we know it, Sui has rushed off, carrying his bag along a pebbly country road towards a small bridge over a stream. He rushes back excitedly. Quick as a fish, he leaps into the driver's seat. Fish, I'm sure there are fish there, he muttered, more to himself than by way of explanation. Left my net behind in the trunk. Really stupid. We drove full tilt along the pebbly road, which is raised above the soggy pasture around. Suddenly, we aren't moving anymore. A wheel has got stuck in the soft mud beneath the pebbles and can find no grip. We attempt a lot, but the wheels merely churn around on the surface. Sui curses and tries to reverse. The back wheel slips off the road into the waterlogged soil and wet grass. For a few minutes, Sui sits and curses with great vehemence. He then gets out of the truck and starts to work with the spade on the mud near the back wheel. Gyanseng and I follow him. We work with our hands to get some of the pebbles away in order to make the ramp for the back wheel to drive upon. A villager appears, sits down, laughs, and makes no attempts at assistance. When Sui asks him for some help, he tells him to help himself. Every time Sui gets the truck moving, the wheels slither and slip in the slush. We hoist the truck up with the jack and try to clear the mud from under the wheels. By now, a small crowd has come from the village across the bridge. They watch us work in silence. Gyanseng and I go over to the bridge, which is covered with chips of stone. We gather a few of these rough chips to replace the smooth pebbles under the wheels, so that the tire can get some purchase on the ground. But the strategy is not a success, and it is getting dark. Then Gyanseng goes to the villagers and talks to them in Tibetan. They come over to help. A tractor appears from across the bridge. It pulls, we push, but this is not enough. 2 more spades are brought. Sui curses himself and the truck and the stream, which the villagers say contains no fish. Gyanseng and I get back into the truck and wrap ourselves up against the cold. But Sui keeps working on the road in a kind of self-rage in which it doesn't matter that it is raining or freezing, or that we are trying to get some sleep. Every half hour he gets back into the truck and puts it into gear. But it is useless. At 4 in the morning, having pushed the wheels in deeper, he gives up. Finally, we get some sleep.
Chapter 8. A.R. Rahman. Do you have interest in music? If yes, you must have heard the name of A.R. Rahman, an Indian composer, singer, songwriter, music producer, musician, multi-instrumentalist, and philanthropist. Described as the world's most prominent and prolific music composer by Time magazine, his works are notable for integrating Eastern classical music with electronic music sounds, world music genre, and traditional orchestral arrangement. Now, read the following piece of interview with the music maestro A.R. Rahman, which is based on interviews given by him to various news channels.
Interview. Welcome, Rahman sir. We wish to know about your journey from Kodampakam to Hollywood. Thank you. Nice to be here. My journey has been very unpredictable. When I was a child, I never thought that I could perform properly. I became famous from the age of 11 because I was in a children's show on TV every Sunday. I used to play film songs that made me quite popular. Fame was not an unusual thing even then. But my confidence level in talking to media took shape with age and time. It's great to meet one's favorite stars like Oliver Stone and visit places in America like Los Angeles. So it is really a big trip from there to here. Are you satisfied with what God has blessed you with? Yes, in a way, yes. Do you consider yourself to be lucky? Well, I think it is a very complex question. Luck can happen once, and then we need to sustain it. For that, we need to have a state of mind and a way of life, I think. Because I feel that there is definitely a destiny part and the divinity part, which is again based on the love and prayers of well-wishers. One of the forces that has shaped up your life has been your mother. Is that so? When I was quite young, my father died. My mother suffered greatly to build up my career. When I made my studio, she invested money in it and bought the equipment. Whenever necessary, she would stand like a wall for my protection. She knew my state of mind. She knew that some guys would disturb me. So she made sure that they did not distract me. Whatever decisions she took were guided by the fact that I remain in the field of music because I was not very clear at that time that music was my future. I was more interested in other things, scientific things and electronics. I am grateful to her for drawing me well and realizing my potential. With success in probably every musical composition, how have you timed your tasks? I started doing very limited films. When a composer used to do 30 films in a year, I would take up only 4 or 5. I said that it was enough for me. I always live with the song. Sometimes for a week, sometimes for 6 months, to try and fix whatever is wrong with it. Because if I don't like something, people will not like it either. I've gone by that rule and so far it's been working. God has been kind. I do not want too much of crowd. Music is something like a baby in the mother's womb till 9 months. Isn't it? You cannot just expose it before it comes out. So, it is something like that for me. That is the reason why I work in a very isolated way. It is very different from the musical concerts that are very much in these days. Being in the film industry is a very difficult thing. You have seen your parents struggle there. What have you learnt in terms of working within the film industry, and how have you changed the way you work? My faith in Sufism was a major change in my life. After selecting that path, I think I could probably separate myself from so many things and look at it from a very external point of view. So, whether it is fame, money, people, love, or anything, or even music, I completely dissociate with that and go outside to look at it from another point of view. I believe that music is a service, in a way, actually an art. Tell us about some important people in your life. Apart from my family, very few people could understand what I wanted to do. Sridhar was one of them and a couple of other musicians whom I work with. He was my sound engineer, but I looked upon him as another composer. We saw each other more than anybody, more than a wife or a family or anything. We worked for 14 to 18 hours a day and went to see our family for 1 hour and then sleep. His death has left a great vacuum in my life. So I believe that sometimes we are more intimate with our friends.
I had very few people with me till my first 10 years.
I think it was only Sridhar and then Shivakumar and many other guys like Sami and Noel who became more intimate to me. What was your reaction when you got nominated for the Oscars and later after lifting the 2 Oscars? Surprised, because we entered 2 songs and on both the songs we got the Oscars. It's a big deal. And was Danny Boyle surprised? He was thrilled actually, yeah. A quick question about Jai Ho. Where did you come up with the idea of getting different sounds? You have Spanish, you have Hindi, and you have English. How did you compose the song Jai Ho? Well, I think it was almost like a celebration. I do not know. It was just that we wanted to do a crazy song. So, I wanted to write an original song, and sometimes you get this instinct and you just go with it. How has winning Oscars changed your life? Yes, the Oscar has changed my life. I can't even attend places of prayers without being recognized. Even when I am at the malls in the US, kids freeze in recognition when they see me. I will have to concentrate on my music. I'm not the kind of guy who can pull himself away from music, attend functions, give interviews, and get back to what I'm supposed to do. What is the approach of the West for the Asian world after you have lifted the Oscars? The impact of Slumdog Millionaire has been tremendous. The Western perception of third world countries has changed. Earlier, when some of the most talented musicians of Asia would approach Western companies, they would encounter stumbling blocks. Today, that has changed. The West is ready to listen to us. Kindly tell us about the song you composed for the London Olympics 2012. Oh yes, I composed a Punjabi song for the London Olympics opening ceremony, organized by Danny Boyle. It was part of a medley which showcased Indian influence in the UK. It was really a nice experience for me. It was such a pleasure talking to you. Wish you all the best. Thank you.
Chapter 9. Padmini, the Queen of Chittor. Medieval history of India is full of stories related to courage and valor of Rajput men and women. We are going to study a translated, dramatic adaptation of a selected extract from the Bengali story Padmini by Abindranath Tagore. The stage curtain is half lit. Shanai strains of Raga Basant, joyful cries of Holi hai! Vagon is here in Chittor. It is holy. Chittor, a small and well-fortified kingdom ruled by Hindu kings in medieval Rajputana. Those were troubled times, wrought by many battles. Enemies travelled from far to conquer this flourishing desert land, home to Rajput royalty and valor. The local rulers tried to uphold their spirit of independence amidst such threats. Rajput history is replete with vibrant memories of battle cries, the clamour of weapons, and of colourful legends surrounding brave Surya Vansh princes like Prithviraj Chauhan and virtuous queens like Padmini. Scene 1. Holy revelry on the streets of Chittor. Golden yellow light changes to crimson, and the stage is a haze of red. Actors freeze. The story of Queen Padmini begins a century after the throne of Delhi passed on from the Rajputs to the Pathans. Rana Lakshman Singh ascends the throne of Chittor, while the Pathan Badshah Alauddin rules in Delhi. Rana Lakshman Singh's uncle Bhim Singh marries the lovely princess Padmini of Simhala and returns to Chittor. They spend their days in happiness, till Badshah Alauddin hears about the exquisite beauty of the Queen of Chittor. Unsettled by the fire of passion, he decides to conquer Padmini and take her home to Delhi. The news of Alauddin's arrival reached Chittor. All celebrations cease. Enters messenger. Actors break the freeze.
Messenger. Badshah Alauddin's army is at Chittor's doorstep. Prepare to defend your land.
People run out. Elderly couple stays back. Women with folded hands. I fear the worst. Lord, save our land and our queen from the Badshah. What a gory end to holy.
Festivities have given way to a deadly game, playing with blood and the lives of men. The roar of cannon and cries of the wounded will now take over these grounds, wrought barren by the ravages of war. Oh, be fast to return home. The Pathan Badshah's black standard has just appeared on the horizon. Rajaji has ordered all the 7 gates of the fort to be shut.
Messenger leaves. The couple hurries away. The fortress of Chittor was set atop a hill, overlooking vast stretches of sandy plains. Alauddin pitches camp below this hill. Scene 2. Padmini's chamber. Padmini is seated on her bed. At the far end of the stage, white palings demarcate the terrace. Bhim Singh enters the room.
I'm done with the army arrangements. All seems to be fine.
Walks up to Padmini and places a hand on her shoulder.
You're up so late, Padmini. There is a vast ocean outside. Would you like to see it? It is almost like the one with its mighty waves crashing against your palace walls, back in your island home.
Padmini, laughing. Don't jest, my king. Where is the sea in this land of deserts? Bhim Singh leads Padmini to the back of the stage, and they look over the paling. Rana, I see a strange, darker form in the darkness all around, rolling out to the edge of the desert. Is that the ocean? I never knew there was one here. Oh, look at that foamy white crests of the waves.
This is no ordinary sea. It is a sea of men, the Pathan Badshah Alauddin's army. Their tents appear to you as waves. Can you hear the voices of thousands of men breaking the silence of the night? It is not like sea waves crashing against the shore.
Padmini lets out a shriek. Oh, Rana, what was that? A clammy cold touch brushed against my face.
Those were only the tips of the large wings of a black owl that flew past. Padmini.
Oh, why did it have to be that? It is an ill omen. The black owl is never up to any good. I shan't sleep all night. An aura of deep anguish prevails. Scene 3. Alauddin's camp. The first light of dawn. The bugle rings sharp. Alauddin rises from his prayers and paces restlessly.
Alauddin. I had imagined it would be very easy to pluck Padmini from Chittor, but I fear the Rajput swords, vigilant all day and night, protecting her as the ribcage protects the human heart. Many days have gone by since the siege began, and there is no sign of a talk or treaty. My soldiers are restless to return home and enjoy the summer frolics at Chandni Chowk. Should I return empty-handed to Delhi after all?
Enters court messenger.
A cavalryman from Rana Lakshman Singh. Present him.
Rana's messenger enters.
The Rana wishes to know what prompts the Badshah to invade Chittor with such a large army of men. Oh no, rest assured. I have no grouse against the Rana. I have simply come to request the hand of Padmini from the Rana's uncle, Bhim Singh. I shall happily leave Chittor as soon as Padmini joins me. Shahanshah, you are not aware of Rajput traditions. Queen Padmini is the highest symbol of our honor. Even an ordinary Rajput like me would rather die fighting than lose our honor. Forget the queen, sir, if there is anything else you desire. The Badshah of Hindustan keeps to his words. I'm afraid the Rana's choice is rather limited. It is Padmini or war.
Rana's messenger salutes and leaves. Army bugle breaks the silence. Scene 4. A street scene. The elderly couple and other citizens watch a line of tall and powerful men with knotted hair and Rudraksha beads around their necks march past, each carrying a trident and an axe. They march out. A bitter war begins in Chittor. 11 Rajput princes lose their lives fighting. A powerful brigade consisting of 10,000 of the bravest of Rajput men, under the oath of Bhagwan Ekalinga, take over.
It is only in times of great calamity, when grave danger looms large, that these forces of Ekalinga are summoned.
There is no ray of hope anywhere. It is time now for our women and children to perform Johar and jump into the fire in front of the temple of Chittorswari to save themselves from dishonor at the hands of the conquerors. A gloomy pall descends on the gold-hued walls of Chittor. No ray of hope lines the dark clouds. Thus, on a moonless night, when the earth takes refuge under a sea of darkness, and the skies are a dull inky black. 12,000 Rajput women gather around the temple of Chittorswari, ready to perform Johar. Padmini, like a lotus in full bloom, stands amidst them. At the end of a dark tunnel facing the temple of Chittoreswari, deep crimson light, a line of women face the backdrop, lights showing leaping flames. Women chant, "Oh, Chittoreswari, save our honor, allow us to embrace these flames and end our cursed existence." Under the siege of alien conquerors, a sudden burst of crimson light and smoke. All falls quiet. As day breaks, Rajput forces move down Chittor's hills like a surge of flood water. A bloody battle follows. As the sun sets, scavenger birds hover over the battlefield. Chittor is captured and ruined. But Padmini, for whose sake Alauddin abandoned the throne in Delhi and travelled afar, is nowhere to be seen. As he enters Chittor, Alauddin hears that fire has engulfed and reduced the beautiful queen to ashes. The Badshah leaves Chittor, a dejected man. Padmini's legend continues. At the great burning ghat of Chittor, one can still see the queen's fire pit. Chapter 10. Lines written in early spring. Do you like to enjoy the beauty of nature? Imagine the different types of sound you hear when you are in the lap of nature. The poet of this poem has tried to build a bond between nature and man through this poem. Simultaneously, he is comparing the changes that have occurred in man regarding nature. Let's read the poem.
I heard 1,000 blended notes, while in a groove I sate reclined. In that sweet mood, when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind, to her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. Through primrose tufts, in that sweet bower, the periwinkle trailed its wreaths, and 'tis my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. The birds around me hopped and played. Their thoughts I cannot measure, but the least motion which they made, it seemed a thrill of pleasure. The budding twigs spread out their fan to catch the breezy air, and I must think, do all I can, that there was pleasure there. If this belief from heaven be sent, if such be nature's holy plan, have I not reason to lament what man has made of man?
Chapter 11. Jim Corbett. Have you ever visited any national park? Share your experience with your classmates. Do you know what a national park is meant for? It is meant for protection and conservation of wild animals. Many people also have played a vital role in protection and conservation of wild animals. The piece of writing we are going to study is dedicated to a great wildlife conservationist who devoted his whole life to the protection and conservation of wild animals, especially tigers. Jim Corbett was one of the greatest shikaris of India. He did not shoot for sport. He shot only dangerous animals like man-eating tigers and leopards, or else he shot for food. Amongst the famous man-eaters that he killed was the man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag, who had killed 114 persons. He also killed the Panar man-eater, who had devoured 400 human beings. Jim's skill in hunting was self-taught. He learnt to use the catapult by himself. Then he learnt to use the bow and arrow. And when he was 8 years old, he learnt to use an old broken-down gun. Jim was lucky that he lived in a place called Kaladungi, which was situated in the middle of thick forests. Near his house were 2 dry sandy nalas, and a little distance away from these nalas was a canal. Animals of all sorts had to cross these nalas to drink water from the canal. It was here that Jim learned his first lessons in tracking. At first, he found the tracks very confusing. The tracks of a young sambar and a blue bull were very similar to each other. He also got confused between the tracks of hyenas and wild dogs and those of leopards. But by watching each animal cross the nala and by studying its tracks, he learned to recognize different animals. He became so good at this that he could make out from the tracks of a snake whether the snake was poisonous or not. At night, when he lay down to sleep, he would hear the calls of different animals. Soon he learned to recognize the call of each animal. He learned that not only does each animal have a different call, but also that the same animal will give different calls for different purposes. The call a mother deer gives to her young ones to tell them to come to her is different from her call to warn the herd that a tiger is coming close. Jim learned to walk barefoot in the forest without making the slightest noise. He taught himself to climb trees. He trained his eyes to notice everything. Once, while walking through the jungles, he saw a cobra stung in a hollow tree just as it was about to strike him. He quickly moved away. Another time he saw a leopard's tail through a bush just as it was going to spring on him. Jim even learned to imitate the calls of animals and birds. He could imitate the growl of a tiger and leopard so well that often the tiger mistook the roar for that of its mate. As a young boy, Jim was very scared of the dark. His elder brother, Tom, taught him to overcome his fear the hard way. One evening, Tom took him bear shooting. Leaving him alone in the gloomy ravine, which was known to be the home of many bears, Tom returned home. Poor Jim sat trembling with fear, certain that he would be eaten by a bear. When he actually saw one, he almost died of fright, but he stuck to his post. Next morning, when Tom came to fetch him, Jim did not tell him how scared he had been, but from that day he lost his fear of the dark. Jim started staying out all night in the jungle. He would make a fire with some dry twigs and then lie down beside it. If he heard a tiger growling close by, he just threw another stick into the fire and went back to sleep. In the morning he would get up and start wandering around the jungle, taking in all its secrets and wisdom. Jim often went hunting with his pet dog, Robin. They shared many exciting adventures together. When Jim first set his eyes on Robin, who was then only a dirty 3-month-old puppy, he did not want to keep him. But the puppy came and curled over his feet and licked him so lovingly that he decided to keep him. He took him home, where he gave him a warm water bath and some milk to drink. He was such a friendly and intelligent dog that Jim grew to love him. Jim wanted to train Robin to retrieve birds, so when he was old enough, he took him along for his first hunt. Jim shot a peafowl. It landed in some thorny bushes, and Robin dashed after it. After some time he returned, dragging the wounded bird between his teeth. A few days later, they were walking back home when Robin saw a big troop of langurs. Robin dashed after a langur, which promptly climbed a tree. Jim whistled to call Robin back, but the dog did not listen to his whistle. He chased the langurs. A little distance away were some bushes behind which was a deep nala. Robin had barely entered those bushes when he came running out again, with his tail tucked between his legs. A huge leopard was running after him. Jim was not carrying a gun, and he could not save his dog. The langurs were calling loudly from the trees. The leopard came closer and closer to Robin. And just when he was within reach of Robin, he turned and disappeared on the other side. Robin learnt 2 very useful lessons that day, which he never forgot in his life. First, never to disobey his master's whistle, and secondly, never to chase langurs. He also learned that when langurs give a warning call, it meant that a leopard was nearby. After that day, Robin always obeyed Jim's orders. Robin also learnt, like his master, to keep absolutely still when ordered to do so. He learnt to walk as silently as a cat does in the jungle. He also learnt to pay no attention to any other animal or bird, except the one they were hunting. Chapter 12. An Astrologer's Day. How will you feel if a person whom you were avoiding for a long time appears before you all of a sudden? This story is about an astrologer who meets a person whom he had tried to kill years ago. Punctually at midday, he opened his bag and spread out his professional equipment, which consisted of a dozen cowrie shells, a square piece of cloth with obscure mystic charts on it, a notebook, and a bundle of Palmyra writing. His forehead was resplendent with sacred ash and vermilion, and his eyes sparkled with a sharp, abnormal gleam, which was really an outcome of a continual searching look for customers. But his simple clients took it to be a prophetic light and felt comforted. The power of his eyes was considerably enhanced by their position, placed as they were between the painted forehead and the dark whiskers which streamed down his cheeks. Even a half-wit's eyes would sparkle in such a setting. To crown the effect, he wound a saffron-coloured turban around his head. This colour scheme never failed. People were attracted to him as bees are attracted to cosmos or dahlia stalks. He sat under the boughs of a spreading tamarind tree, which flanked a path running through the town hall park. It was a remarkable place in many ways. A surging crowd was always moving up and down this narrow road from the morning till night. A variety of trades and occupations was represented all along its way: medicine sellers, seller of stolen hardware and junk, magicians, and, above all, an auctioneer of cheap cloth, who created enough din all day to attract the whole town. Next to him in vociferousness came a vendor of fried groundnut, who gave his ware a fancy name each day, calling it Bombay ice cream one day, and on the next Delhi almond, and on the third Raja's delicacy, and so on and so forth, and people flocked to him. A considerable portion of this crowd gathered before the astrologer too. The astrologer transacted his business by the light of a flare which crackled and smoked up above the groundnut heap nearby. Half the enchantment of the place was due to the fact that it did not have the benefit of municipal lighting. The place was lit up by shop lights. 1 or 2 had hissing gaslight. Some had naked flares struck on poles. Some were lit up by old cycle lamps, and 1 or 2, like the astrologer, managed without lights of their own. It was a bewildering criss-cross of light rays and moving shadows. This suited the astrologer very well, for the simple reason that he had not in the least intended to be an astrologer when he began life, and he knew no more of what was going to happen to others than he knew what was going to happen to himself next minute. He was as much a stranger to the stars as were his innocent customers, yet he said things which pleased and astonished everyone. That was more a matter of study, practice, and shrewd guesswork. All the same, it was as much an honest man's labour as any other, and he deserved the wages he carried home at the end of a day. He had left his village without any previous thought or plan. If he had continued there, he would have carried on the work of his forefathers, namely, tilling the land, living, marrying, and ripening in his cornfield and ancestral home. But that was not to be. He had left home without telling anyone, and he could not rest till he left it behind a couple of 100 miles. To a villager, it is a great deal as if an ocean flowed between. He had a working analysis of mankind's troubles, marriage, money, and the tangles of human ties. Long practice had sharpened his perception. Within 5 minutes, he understood what was wrong. He charged 3 pies per question, never opened his mouth till the other had spoken for at least 10 minutes, which provided him enough stuff for a dozen answers and advices. When he told the person before him, gazing at his palm,
In many ways, you are not getting the fullest results from your efforts.
9 out of 10 were disposed to agree with him. Or he questioned,
Is there any woman in your life, maybe even a distant relative, who is not well disposed towards you?
Or he gave an analysis of character.
Most of your troubles are due to your nature. How can you be otherwise with Saturn where he is? You have an impetuous nature and a rough exterior.
This endeared him to their hearts immediately, for even the mildest of us loves to think that he has a forbidding exterior. The nuts vendor blew out his flare and rose to go home. This was a signal for the astrologer to bundle up too, since it left him in darkness, except for a little shaft of green light which strayed in from somewhere. He was putting his things back into his bag when the green shaft of light was blotted out. He looked up and saw a man standing before him. He sensed a possible client and said,
You look so crane-worm. It will do you good to sit down for a while and chat with me.
The other grumbled some reply vaguely. The astrologer pressed his invitation, whereupon the other thrust his palm under his nose, saying,
You call yourself an astrologer.
The astrologer felt challenged and said, tilting the other's palm towards the green shaft of light,
Yours is a nature. Oh, stop that.
The other said,
Tell me something worthwhile.
Our friend felt piqued.
I charge only 3 pies per question, and what you get ought to be good enough for your money.
At this the other withdrew his arm, took out an anna, and flung it out to him, saying,
I have some questions to ask. If I prove you are bluffing, you must return that anna to me with interest. If you find my answers satisfactory, will you give me 5 rupees? No. Or will you give me 8 annas? All right, provided you give me twice as much if you are wrong,
said the stranger. This pact was accepted. After a little further argument, the astrologer sent up a prayer to heaven as the other lit a cheroot. The astrologer caught a glimpse of his face by the matchlight. There was a pause as cars hooted on the road. Chitka drivers swore at their horses, and the babble of the crowd agitated the semi-darkness of the park. The other sat down sucking his cheroot, puffing out, sat there ruthlessly. The astrologer felt very uncomfortable.
Here, take your anna back. I am not used to such challenges. It is late for me today.
He made preparations to bundle up. The other held his wrist and said,
You can't get out of it now. You dragged me in while I was passing.
The astrologer shivered in his grip, and his voice shook, and he became faint.
Leave me today. I will speak to you tomorrow.
The other thrust his palm in his face and said,
Challenge is challenge. Go on.
The astrologer proceeded with his throat up.
There is a woman. Stop,
said the other.
I don't want all that. Shall I succeed in my present search or not? Answer this and go. Otherwise, I will not let you go till you disgorge all your coins.
The astrologer muttered a few incantations and replied,
All right, I will speak. But will you give me a rupee if what I say is convincing? Otherwise, I will not open my mouth, and you may do what you like.
After a good deal of haggling, the other agreed. The astrologer said,
You were left for dead, am I right? Ah, tell me more. A knife has passed through you once,
said the astrologer.
Good fellow.
He bared his chest to show the scar.
What else? And then you were pushed into a well nearby in the field. You were left for dead. I should have been dead if some passerby had not chanced to peep into the well,
exclaimed the other, overwhelmed by enthusiasm.
When shall I get at him?
He asked, clenching his fist.
In the next world,
answered the astrologer.
He died 4 months ago in a far-off town. You will never see any more of him.
The other groaned on hearing it. The astrologer proceeded.
Guru Nayak. You know my name?
The other said, taken aback.
As I know all other things, Guru Nayak, listen carefully to what I have to say. Your village is 2 days' journey due north of this town. Take the next train and be gone. I see once again great danger to your life if you go from home.
He took out a pinch of sacred ash and held it to him.
Rub it on your forehead and go home. Never travel southward again, and you will live to be 100. Why should I leave home again?
The other said reflectively,
I was only going away now and then to look for him and to choke out his life if I met him.
He shook his head regretfully.
He had escaped my hands. I hope at least he died as he deserved. Yes,
said the astrologer.
He was crushed under a lorry.
The other looked gratified to hear it. The place was deserted by the time the astrologer picked up his articles and put them into his bag. The green shaft was also gone, leaving the place in darkness and silence. The stranger had gone off into the night, after giving the astrologer a handful of coins. It was nearly midnight when the astrologer reached home. His wife was waiting for him at the door and demanded an explanation. He flung the coins at her and said,
Count them. One man gave all that.
12.5 annas, she said, counting. She was overjoyed. I can buy some jaggery and coconut tomorrow. The child has been asking for sweets for so many days. Now I will prepare some nice stuff for her.
The swine has cheated me. He promised me a rupee,
said the astrologer. She looked at him. You look worried. What is wrong?
Nothing.
After dinner, sitting on the pile, he told her,
Do you know a great load is gone from me today? I thought I had the blood of a man on my hands all these years. That was the reason why I ran away from home, settled here and married you. He is alive.
She gasped. You tried to kill?
Yes, in our village, when I was a silly youngster. We drank, gambled, and quarreled badly one day. Why to think of it now? Time to sleep,
he said, yawning, and stretched himself on the pile. Chapter 13. O Captain, my Captain, get ready. Who is your favorite leader? What are his or her achievements for the nation and the people? The poem we are going to read is about the great leader of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, who abolished slavery from the United States in 1865. He was successful in his mission, but was assassinated the same year. The poet Walt Whitman wrote this poem, which captures the grief of the people at the loss of their great leader.
O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting. While follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But O heart, 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 O the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquet and ribbon wreaths, for you the shore a-crowding. For you they call, the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored, safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells. But I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead.
Chapter 14. The Canterville Ghost. The topic of ghosts has always been very exciting for the people of all age groups. Do ghosts really exist? Have you ever felt their presence around you? What will you do if a ghost appears before you all of a sudden? Don't worry. Your fear regarding ghosts will vanish after reading the story. When Mr. Hiram B. Otis, the American minister, bought Canterville Chase, everyone told him he was doing a very foolish thing. There was no doubt that the place was haunted. Lord Canterville himself had felt it his duty to mention the fact to Mr. Otis before he bought the house. Mr. Otis, however, laughed at his warnings and bought the house. A few weeks later, he and his wife, their son Washington, their daughter Virginia, and their twin boys moved to Canterville Chase. When they arrived at the house, an old woman was standing on the steps to meet them. This was Mrs. Umney, the housekeeper, who had worked in the house for Lord and Lady Canterville. "Welcome to Canterbury Chase," she said, and took them through the house to the library, where tea was waiting for them. After they had taken off their coats and hats, they sat down while Mrs. Umney poured the tea. Suddenly, Mrs. Otis caught sight of a dull red stain on the floor just by the fireplace. "I'm afraid something had been spilt there, Mrs. Umney," she said. "Yes, madam," replied the old housekeeper in a low voice. "Blood has been spilt on that spot." "How awful!" cried Mrs. Otis. "I don't care at all for bloodstains in a sitting room. It must be removed at once." The old woman smiled and answered in the same low, mysterious voice. "It is the blood of Lady Eleanor of Canterville, who was murdered on that very spot by her own husband, Sir Simon of Canterville, in 1575. Sir Simon disappeared 9 years later, and his body has never been found. His guilty ghost still haunts the Chase. The bloodstain has been admired by visitors to the house, and it cannot be removed."
"That is all nonsense,"
cried Washington Otis.
"Pinkerton's stain remover and perfect cleaner will clean it up very quickly."
Before the housekeeper could interfere, he had fallen on his knees and was rubbing the floor with a small black stick. In a few minutes, the blood stain had disappeared.
"I knew Pinkerton's would do it,"
he cried, as he looked around at his admiring family. But as soon as he had said these words, a terrible flash of lightning lit up the room. A fearful crash of thunder made them all jump to their feet, and Mrs. Umney fainted. In a few minutes, however, she was able to sit up. There was no doubt that she was very unhappy, and she warned Mr. Otis that trouble would come to the house. "I've seen things with my own eyes, sir," she said, "that would make your hands stand on their ends with fright. Many nights I have not been able to sleep for the awful things that are done here." Mr. and Mrs. Otis, however, told her that they were not afraid of ghosts, and she at last went slowly out to her own room. The storm blew fiercely all that night. The next morning, when they came down to breakfast, they found the terrible stain of blood once again on the floor.
"I don't think it can be the fault of the perfect cleaner,"
said Washington.
"I have tried it with everything. It must be the ghost."
He rubbed out the stain a second time, but the second morning it appeared again. It was there again on the third morning, though the library had been locked up all night by Mr. Otis himself, and the key taken upstairs. The whole family was now quite interested. That night they all went to bed at 11 o'clock, and by 11:30 all the lights were out. Some time later, Mr. Otis was awakened by a curious noise in the corridor outside his room. It sounded like the rattle of metal and seemed to be coming nearer every moment. He got up at once, struck a match, and looked at the time. It was exactly 1 o'clock. The strange noise still continued, and with it he heard the sound of footsteps. He put on his shoes, took a small bottle out of his case, and opened the door. Right in front of him he saw in the pale moonlight a terrible old man. His eyes were as red as burning fire. Long grey hair fell over his shoulders. His clothes were old-fashioned, dirty and ragged. Heavy chains hung from his wrists and ankles.
"My dear sir,"
said Mr. Otis,
"I really must insist on your putting some oil on those chains. I have brought you a small bottle of Tammany Rising Sun oil. I shall leave it here for you by the bedroom candles, and will be happy to bring you some more if you need it."
He laid the bottle down on a table and, closing his door, went back to bed. For a moment the Canterville ghost stood quite still. Then he threw the bottle upon the polished floor and ran down the corridor, making low groaning noises and glowing green in the darkness. Just as he reached the top of the great oak staircase, a door opened. 2 little twin children dressed in white appeared, and a pillow flew past his head. There was no time to be lost, so he disappeared through the wall, and the house became quite quiet. On reaching a small secret room, he leaned against a moonbeam to get his breath back. Never in all his 300 years of haunting had anyone been so rude to him. He thought of the Duchess, whom he had frightened badly, as she stood before her mirror in her lace and diamonds. He thought of the 4 housemaids who had screamed when he had smiled at them through the curtains of one of the spare bedrooms. Then there was the man whose candle he had blown out as he was on his way from the library, and who had been ill ever since. And now, after all this, some awful Americans had come and had offered him the Rising Sun oil, and had thrown pillows at his head. It was too awful. Besides, no ghost in history had ever been treated in this manner. Chapter 15. The Dusk. Have you ever been cheated by anyone? If yes, what made you believe his or her words? This story is about a person who, in spite of being alert, got cheated by a stranger. Let's read this interesting story. Norman Coatsby sat on a bench in a corner of the Hyde Park, with his back to a fenced area of grass, planted with bushes. It was dusk, about 30 minutes past 6 on an early March evening. The atmosphere was a mixture of falling daylight, pale moonlight, and light from the street lamps a little distance away. On the bench by his side sat an elderly gentleman. He had the expression of a defeated person who refused to admit his defeat. His clothes were neither expensive nor new. As he got up to go, Coatsby imagined him to be a man in whom no one was particularly interested, either at home or outside. As his figure disappeared slowly into the shadow, his place on the bench was taken almost immediately by a young man, fairly well dressed, but not more cheerful than the man who had sat there before. As if to emphasize the fact that he was deeply troubled and unhappy, the newcomer uttered a curse or two as he threw himself into the seat.
"You don't seem in a very good temper,"
said Coatsby, judging that he was expected to show sympathy. The young man turned to him with a look of great frankness, which put Coatsby instantly on his guard.
"You wouldn't be in a good temper if you were in the fix that I'm in,"
he said.
"I've done the silliest thing I've ever done in my life." "Yes,"
said Coatsby, without much enthusiasm.
"I came up to London this afternoon, intending to stay at the Patagonian Hotel in Berkshire Square,"
continued the young man.
"When I got there, I found that the hotel had been pulled down some weeks ago and a cinema theatre has been put in its place. The taxi driver commended me to another hotel some way off and I went there. I just sent a letter to my people, giving them the address, and then I went to buy some soap. I'd forgotten to pack any, and I hate using hotel soap. Then I strolled about a bit and looked at the shops. And when I thought of turning my steps back to the hotel, I suddenly realized that I didn't remember its name or even the street it was in. Now, that's a nice situation for a fellow to be in, who hasn't any friends or connections in London. I'm without any money, came out with only a shilling on me, which went in buying the soap and the drink. So here I am, wandering about with 2 pence in my pocket and nowhere to go for the night."
There was a meaningful pause after the story had been told.
"I suppose you think I've made up an impossible cock and bull story for you,"
said the young man, presently in a hurt voice.
"Not at all impossible,"
said Coatsby carefully.
"I remember doing exactly the same thing once in a foreign city. And on that occasion, there were 2 of us. Luckily, we remembered that the hotel was on a sort of canal. So when we came across the canal, we were able to make our way back to the hotel."
The youth brightened up a little on hearing this.
"In a foreign city, I wouldn't mind so much,"
he said.
"One could go to one's consul and get the required help from him. Here, in one's own land, one is far more helpless if one gets into a fix like this. Unless I can find some decent chap to swallow my story and lend me some money. I seem likely to spend the night on the bank of the Thames. I'm glad, however, that you don't think the story totally improbable."
He threw a great deal of warmth into the last remark, as if perhaps to indicate his hope that Coatsby himself might be such a decent chap.
"Of course,"
said Coatsby slowly.
"the weak point of your story is that you can't show me the soap."
The young man sat forward hurriedly, felt rapidly in the pockets of his overcoat, and then jumped to his feet.
"I must have lost it,"
he muttered angrily.
"To lose a hotel as well as a cake of soap on the same afternoon suggests willful carelessness,"
said Coatsby, but the young man did not wait to hear the end of his remark. He hurried away down the path, his head held high, with an expression of well-practiced anger and pride.
It was a pity.
Thought Catesby to himself.
The bit about going out to buy one's own soap was the one convincing part of the whole story. And yet, it was just that little detail that brought him to grief. If he had the brilliant forethought to provide himself with a newly bought cake of soap, he would have been a genius in his particular profession.
With these thoughts, Catesby rose to go. As he did so, he gave a cry of surprise and anxiety. Lying on the ground by the side of the bench was a small packet. It was a newly bought cake of soap. It had obviously fallen out of the young man's coat pocket when he threw himself down on the seat. In another moment, Catesby was rushing along the half-dark path, anxiously looking for a youthful figure in a light coat. He had nearly given up the search when he caught sight of the young man standing uncertainly on the border of the road, evidently trying to decide which way to go. When Catesby called him, he turned sharply with an expression of challenge.
The important witness to the truth of your story has now appeared,
said Catesby, holding out the cake of soap.
It must have slipped out of your overcoat pocket when you sat down on the seat. I saw it on the ground after you left. You must excuse my earlier disbelief, but appearances were really rather against you. And now, if the loan of a sovereign is any good to you—
The young man replied by taking the coin hastily and pocketing it.
Here is my card with my address,
continued Catesby.
You can return the money any day this week, and here is the soap. Don't lose it again. It's been a good friend to you. Lucky thing, you're finding it,
said the youth. And then, as if finding it difficult to speak, he uttered a word or two of thanks and hurried away in the direction of Knightsbridge.
Poor boy, he nearly broke down,
said Catesby to himself.
I'm not surprised. It must have been such a great relief to him. It's a lesson to me not to be too clever in judging people by circumstances.
As Catesby walked back to his seat in the park, he saw an elderly gentleman looking and feeling with his hands beneath the bench and all around it. Catesby recognized him as the man who had sat there before the young man.
Have you lost anything, sir?
He asked.
Yes, sir, a cake of soap.
Chapter 16. How many times do you see yourself in the mirror daily? It shows you exactly how you look. The poet has taken the same topic as the theme of the poem. Let's read the poem and find out what the poet wants to say.
I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. Whatever I see, I swallow immediately, just as it is, unmisted by love or dislike. I am not cruel, only truthful. The eye of a little god, four-cornered. Most of the time I meditate on the opposite wall. It is pink with speckles. I have looked at it so long. I think it is part of my heart, but it flickers. Faces and darkness separate us over and over. Now I am a lake. A woman bends over me, searching my reaches for what she really is. Then she turns to those liars, the candles or the moon. I see her back and reflect it faithfully. She rewards me with tears and an agitation of hand. I am important to her. She comes and goes. Each morning it is her face that replaces the darkness. In me she had drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman. Rises towards her day after day, like a terrible fish.